Well, thank you, Michaela. I'm here with Michaela Swales, the president of the World DBT Association, and I'm honored to be able to have this discussion with you to gain more insight and knowledge into this organization and the work that you are doing. So, if you want, can you give us a little bit of background on you and just
Okay,
who
sure.
you are
Who
and
I am and how
who
I
you
ended
are
up in
and what you're
this position.
doing and how
Yes.
you came about into this role and
Yeah.
with World DBTA.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist by background and always worked with young people actually with adolescents. And I first trained in DBT back in 1994 now. Came to Seattle to do a I went to Seattle to do my intensive training and then came back to the UK and we were the first team in the UK to implement DBT and really from that I developed a passion for implementing DBT, training in DBT, and teaching others to do the same. And I suppose that in a way is kind of how I ended up in this position, I suppose, is that I first of all trained a lot in the UK, but then further afield. And my research and implementation, I think, was one of the things that resulted in me being part of the training and implementation group that's part of WDBTA. But to just sort of step a bit, it's kind of like, well, but what was the WDBTA? Well, it really came about when Marsha was retiring, and that those of us who were involved in different elements, research, a big one, but also training, we recognize, that Marsha and all that she had established, she was kind of like the touchstone about all of the developments that were happening in the world, and that people wanted to seek her thoughts, seek her wisdom about all of these things. And as she was stepping back and retiring, there was a feeling in the DBT community that we needed somehow to still be able to fulfill those important functions. For example, what is the essence of DBT? What is the core of the treatment? How do we know when something is DBT versus whether it's an adaptation of a DBT? Not that there's a problem about an adaptation, but it's important to be clear about which is
Mhm.
which. And of course, in the past, normally, it would be like you would ask Marsha, right? Would be the thing to
Yeah.
and likewise with research, there was the strategic planning meeting, which Marsha coordinated. And so there was just this feeling that when she, retired from the stage, that in a way, those functions could potentially retire with her. And it was thought that that really wouldn't be helpful, and that we wanted to keep the community together. There'd always been a strong sense of community. And so there were about 35 of us who met um, in at other events that were happening where DBT people often are. So around about ABCT and Is It DBT, and then also at conferences in Europe. We had meetings over quite a long time to think, well, what do we want to do and how do we want to take it forward? And
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 these
in
were the strategic planning meetings that came out
Yes,
of.
yes. So that at those sort of meetings, we sort of formed groups that had interests in particular things. So, like the research group, which sort of took on the issue about research aspects. Then we had the training and implementation group, which was thinking about issues relating to training. And then another group that was thinking about treatment integrity. How do we recognize what is DBT? How do we promote what is DBT? And also help to recognize when something isn't DBT. Not that that's a problem, but just it's important for research and implementation to be clear. And of course, there's a bit of an interesting dialectical tension between, you know, on the one hand, trying to respect the integrity of the treatment, and on the other hand, this treatment must develop. At its heart, it's an empirical treatment and you want it to develop. So there's an interesting tension there that we want to respect and value, and also to think about the work of dissemination. So we formed groups of interest at that point. Um, and then from each of those interest groups, there was a group that came together, which was loosely based on the group of people who'd run the strategic planning meeting in the past with Marsha, to think about how we could, you know, formalize these relationships and also then have a structure in which to involve others. And so there was a transitional board set up to develop the World DBT Association.
When did that transitional board get established?
Well, that was, now you're testing me. I probably should have checked my facts before I came on, but um, I think we moved from out of the transitional board stage last July in 24, and I think it would have been going for 3 years before that. So we're talking about 21, around about 2020.
And I think that those 3 years is so important to note that this didn't just come about on a whim, that it
Oh
was like, oh,
no.
we need to organize this
Oh,
organization, right? Like it was very strategic
it was
in
very
making
strategic.
sure that
And
the experts are moving this forward.
yes, exactly. And I think also there were lots of challenges. I wasn't on the transitional board, and I think the transitional board, they had to work incredibly hard to think about how to do this because it's not easy to set up an international organization. You have to decide, where is it going to reside? It still has to have a home where it's legally constituted, but how is that going to work when you've got, international partners and you're wanting to develop something that is international? So that took a lot of figuring out, and longer than either the transitional board or the people involved would have wanted it to. But inevitably, these processes are very complex.
And you
And
have to get under the hood to see what you're even working with.
exactly. And also, you've got to recognize really that the people who are doing that they're not. It's not like they've got nothing else to do. Oh, I know. I'll
Exactly.
sit down and let's figure out how to open and do. Or, they're busy people who, and so I think that was also a real challenge. And so the combination of that plus the complexity of the task, I think, was really difficult. But through those 3 years, what they did do was they formally registered the organization, and in order to do that, they had to develop bylaws, and of course, those were sent round for consultation round the bigger group of 35 or thereabouts, to try to figure out a structure. And so we now have this sort of structure, which is kind of got an interesting sort of, well, I think it's an interesting structure. So it's comprised of um, regional chapters, is what we call them. So these are separate organizations in a way. Well, they have to be separately constituted, but they are in relationship with the World DBT organization. And those
So
regional
they're
chapters,
separate entities
they are
that
separate entities, yeah. And we've got three currently that are formed. One is the European chapter, one is the Asia Pacific chapter, and one is the Ibero-America chapter. And there's currently consultations, maybe some of your listeners will have been part of that, about a North American chapter that there's been a survey sent round. So the WDBTA has these, the idea is it has regional chapters, and that there would be chapters from, that eventually all of the bits of the globe will be covered, for who, or those bits of the globe that want to be involved with DBT would be covered. Um, but that there's representation from those chapters on the board. And then the other thing that we have are these, what we call expert committees. And they cover the areas that those groups I mentioned early on cover. So we've got one on treatment integrity, one on training and implementation, one on dissemination, and the other on research. And those committees, they are comprised of people who are recognized as experts in their particular area, and also representatives from the chapters. And so, but what I would say is that if you think about the different components of the organization, that the sort of the chapters, they take on the responsibility that the organization World DBTA has a number of objectives, missions, if you like, and the chapters really take on the element of the vision and the mission, which is about developing communities of practice that are connected, that are developing DBT, delivering DBT, trying to get DBT out to clients who need it, and supporting each other in that endeavour. Whereas the expert committees, their task is almost in a way to support that, but they address more directly some of the other missions of the WDBTA, which is to, to think about the research development of the treatment, to think about how to train and implement the treatment effectively, and to think about how best to disseminate it. Those committees are, for example, the training committee has produced international guidance about what qualifications you should have to be a trainer of the treatment, and that was produced by working together with different organizations that have done that across the globe and distilling those into some key principles. So, yeah, and I can't even remember what the question was that you asked me. But anyway, that I think I've covered the
You
like
have. And I think it's really
how
like
it's
hearing
structured.
you talk about it, it's really cool concept of like if I just recap this, that Marcia had this vision, right? Like, and I don't think anything's effective have lying on one person's
No,
shoulders, right?
exactly.
So Marcia had this vision of expanding, getting the treatment out there. And essentially what World DBTA is doing is like the hub that is making sure that it doesn't get watered down as it
Yeah.
spreads.
And it's kind of meant to be an enabler. It's not an organization, it's not a training organization, and we don't do training. I mean, people who are involved in it might do training in other roles, but that's not its purpose. Its purpose is to enable, and it enables by providing expert guidance that people hopefully will find useful when they're, delivering. It hopes to spearhead research and to give consultation to researchers about how to investigate the treatment, um, to provide advice to practice to people who are perhaps developing adaptations about how you might do that and stick with the principles. So it's really an enabler, and it's like an expert association, if you like, to really kind of keep Marsha's vision of disseminating the treatment to in a high quality way, to keep that
Yeah.
mission alive, really.
Yeah. And can you speak a little bit? I know there's a few conferences already being
Yeah.
formatted or
Yeah.
formulated
Yes.
in
Yeah.
Asia
Yeah.
Pacific has a conference
Yes.
coming up, I believe. Can you speak a
Yeah.
little bit on the
Yeah.
conference
Sure.
structure of
So
that?
each chapter would be thinking about conferences. So Asia Pacific had what they call a soft launch last autumn, and they're thinking about something coming up this year. Ibero-America will be having a conference in May, and also the European Association has got a conference in May in Gdansk. This again is one of the core missions of the WDBTA through its chapters, is to provide opportunities for practitioners, researchers to get together to learn and develop the treatment. And I think this is one of the things that's interesting is that what you need from the WDBTA varies a lot depending on where you live in the world.
Hmm.
You live in the North America, I live in the UK, and in both of those contexts, we have organized bodies that accredit therapists and practitioners. You're the president of one, but we also have conferences in DBT that practitioners can go to that are well attended. And so, perhaps and that's similar also in places like Germany and the Netherlands, Norway. Um, so I think in those places, sometimes people can think, well, what do we need the WDBTA for? Because we've got all of these things. I've got we've got a conference, like for you all in North America, we've got Is It DBT and we've got LBC. Like, what would we need
Yeah.
WDBTA for? And I think that's a legitimate question to ask. And I think, thinking about that dialectical principle about, parts and wholes and all being kind of connected, is that those of us in those places and countries are resource rich, as it were, and we have something to offer to the community. And there are many, many parts of the world where they don't have any of those
Yeah.
things. They are just small groups of practitioners just starting off, much like it was 30 years ago in North America and in the UK. And they really are desperate. They don't have conferences to go to. It's really difficult for them to get resources in their own language. That's another thing that we're wanting to pay attention to, is how we might get things translated into languages. Because I've trained in places where people don't even have the textbooks in the original language. And,
And I think when you're looking at, when you're looking into World DBTA and just your mission, it really does highlight and bring light to like the bubbles that we live in,
yes,
right? Like
exactly.
we really live in a bubble thinking that the way that North America and the UK is structured is just the way everybody is,
Just the way
right?
it
Like
is.
it's so easy to just think that this is the norm when maybe
Yeah,
this is
like,
actually not the norm. Maybe that's the norm.
no, exactly. And also just things that we might take for granted, like in the US and also in the UK, that it's very clear to us, and also in Germany, that an organization that's training people can't be the organization that's accrediting them. Those two things need to be separate and constituted separately because of the conflict of interest. But that's not the way people think in other parts of the world. And so there are, so bringing some of these ideas and getting people to think through these issues and like how it is we've got to that position and why we do that, to make sure that people are getting good quality training and that there's proper oversight, and that we're still shaping people towards high quality delivery. Those are things that really matter to us in the WDBTA, and trying to really help places and parts of the world where actually it's also very difficult to do that when you have very little resource and there isn't a lot of funding either for training or for service delivery. Yeah.
And the chapters then also respect and work within
They
their
do.
entity, right? Like in what they have working with, as opposed to taking a US North American and process and trying to apply it in Asia
No,
or
they
try to
have
apply
to
it somewhere
try
else that
and
doesn't
figure
work.
out what would work in their regions. And
Exactly.
also the chapters are very different. So for example, in Europe, the European chapter, to you can't join the European chapter as a person. The members of the European chapter, a bit like the chapters relative to the WDBTA, but the members of the European chapter are national associations. So like the Society for DBT in the UK and Ireland and the Deutsche DAC-Verband, those are national associations and they are members of the European Association. Um, Whereas in Asia Pacific, many of the countries there don't have national associations, and so individuals can be members of those associations. So, depending on how your organization is structured, how your region really is structured and the amount of development that there's been in, the chapters are a little bit different in the way they do that, and they have to be responsive to what's needed in their areas. Um, yeah. And all of the chapters, I would say, they've got pockets of really well developed, countries that have got well developed structures, and then other countries which maybe have partial development of structures, and then other places where maybe all they have are, groups of people who are starting off to do DBT. And so within the chapters, they're really trying to harness that expertise for those who've, been fortunate to be able to develop that over the years, and harness that to really help those people who are starting off.
Yeah. And and I think a lot of the North American listeners would are probably familiar with DBTLBC and the organization. And so I want to make sure that there's like a clear delineation
Yeah.
of with the World DBTA, it's a membership organization,
It
correct?
is, yes. It's not an accrediting body. It's not about that. It might have things to say. So for example, we have some guidance on what sort of curriculum you should follow if you're going to become a DBT therapist, for example. And we've got guidance on if you're going to train in the treatment, what sort of things you should know. But we are not the ones who are saying we're not. accrediting
Yes.
therapists. That's the task of, in some countries that would be the task of the National Association. Like in the UK, for example, we've got a Society for DBT in the UK and Ireland, which is almost like an amalgamation of is it DBT and the Linehan Board of Certification, in the sense that it both accredits therapists and programs, and it also runs conferences. Yeah. And that's quite a common combination in parts of Europe. Um, so so in the World DBT Association, nor its chapters are not into, that's a matter for individual countries and organizations to decide how to do that, the accreditation of therapists, or certification, as you would say in the
Yeah.
US.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for the conferences, do you have to be a member to attend? Like, could somebody that wanted to attend one of
Oh
the
yes,
European
anyone you could.
conference,
Yeah, yeah, you don't have
anybody
to
could
be a
attend?
member to attend. No, no, we want the broadest possible. Anyone who's interested in DBT, that's the only requirement, that you're interested in DBT to come to a conference. Um, the chapters, um, of course, are and World DBTA, we're new organizations. And so the challenge of in these circumstances is funding. And so the different chapters have taken different approaches to that. And so some chapters have resources that only members have access to, which, was, to try and promote being a member. But conferences is not one of those things. Conferences open to all. Yeah.
Are all of the chat, well, this is probably a question that is d dependent on the chapter, but World DBTA is a nonprofit,
Yes, they're all not.
501(c)(3) or 6?
Oh, now then, that's a very technical question, which my finance person could probably tell
Okay,
you. But I
but
don't,
it
but
is a
it is
nonprofit.
non-profit. It's non-profit. They're all
And are all
non-profit.
is that internationally, or they're
Yes,
nonprofit, like they're all
yeah.
nonprofit on
They're all
some?
non-profit. Yeah, they're
Okay.
all non-profit. And so the only reason that we're seeking funding is to do things that, because one of the things is when you set up any organization is that if you have no administrative support, it slows everything down. And that's really what people are hoping, by running conferences, that there'll be some kind of funding that will enable administrative support to, to do some of the things that people would be wanting, to support the development of guidance, to, develop newsletters and information for members and that sort of thing. So yeah, but so it's all non-profit. Yeah.
So if somebody wanted to support and there's a way to donate on the
Yes, there
World
is a way to
DBTA
donate.
Association
Yes, yes,
webpage?
yeah, there is a way to donate, and we are looking for donors. We would like some donors, um, just simply because it will speed up and smooth some of our work. That we're hoping, there are a number of things that we're hoping to develop. In particular, we have run a couple of strategic planning meetings, but they've been somewhat smaller and than they have in the past. And we'd like to really think about how to develop that and how to really support people who are setting off in their research journeys. And so we are keen to be, if people do want to donate, we'd be very grateful to receive it. Yeah.
And where is the vision going when you
Yeah.
look
Well,
ahead?
yeah, looking ahead, I mean, I think that's one of the things we're working on as the board right now, is that I think, up until last July, the the vision was to actually get this thing founded. Yeah. That was the vision. And so like we've got
Check. Got
that.
one. You got it.
Yeah,
That checked.
like we got that. Yeah. So now looking forward, it's like now we're really getting into the work. And so that's one of the things I've been visiting with the different committees to see what it is that they're thinking about, and also hearing from the chapters about what it is that they're looking for. And so, in terms of chapters, I think the vision really there is to develop their community so that they have connections with the therapists in their region, to provide conferences and to offer other things that the region may want. I think a big thing that most of the chapters are really thinking about is how to support their constituent organizations or members to really promote getting training in people's original language. so often people are having to access training through typically the medium of English or sometimes Spanish, and it's not their mother tongue. And for some people, that's fine. And in order to get it started in another language, you need that. You need someone who's got a high facility in another language that there's been a lot of development and resources in. But I think that's one thing that they're really thinking about. How might we really take that forward? And that involves, translation of materials, but also thinking about how to support the training of therapists and to guide them. Not that we'll be doing any of the training, but it's like, how do you support and give advice to organizations to think about developing high quality training in your region? So I think that's some of the concern, the sort of preoccupations of the vision, if you like, of the chapters moving forward. In terms of the expert committees in the training and implementation group, for example, we are working currently, we're reviewing the literature on DBT implementation, so that we can write some guidance that would be relevant both to organizations looking at implementation, but also bigger systems and indeed countries who are thinking about implementing. What might be some of the things you would need to think about? The Treatment Integrity Committee is thinking about how, sometimes we're wanting to make sure that people, now that there's a proliferation of resources, when I first trained in DBT, there was only like the 2 treatment manuals and that was it. But now there's a proliferation of things, and sometimes it's hard for people to know, is this like the real
There's a
deal?
lot of
There's a
self-published
lot of self-publishing.
translations.
It's hard to know, and so we're thinking about how we might assist consumers to know what is high quality DBT. And so if people so we're just thinking about how we might go about doing that, because we definitely don't want to be the DBT police. That's not what we're interested in, but we do want to be able to give clear signals to consumers, and that would include people who are learning the treatment as well as people who are consuming the treatment, about what they should what they should expect, and what is really good guidance. So we're in the Treatment Integrity Committee are thinking about how to take that forward in an effective way. And then in terms of the research committee, as I say, we're thinking about I'm not going to say we're going to organize a World DBT Congress, because I think there's lots of conferences.
I learned that going through LBC, just the difference in governing bodies and
Yeah,
the licensure and all of that just
and all of that.
seems.
Yeah, but also in terms of just, if we think about it, that the World DBT Association is made up of people who are also in all of the chapters, and so like there's a duplication of effort and time. So, but what in the WDBTA we're really wanting to think about is bringing together the research piece internationally and thinking about what can we learn from each other, what can we, what if we are to assess the literature where it is, where do we want to be going next? And I think this was one of the things that the strategic planning meeting under Marsha's leadership was very successful at, that they would think about what is it that was known about the treatment and what was it that needed to come next. And that was what led to both of the PTSD treatments that we now have, DBT prolonged exposure and DBT PTSD, came from those discussions about we need something that's really targeting that problem. And so I think that's one of the other things as WDBTA, particularly in that research group, that they would be very keen to be thinking about what are the next things that need to be looked at and developed, and how might we do that. And so
And strategic is a really key
is
word
really
in a
key.
lot
Yeah,
of this.
in a lot of this, because I think what we see is we see a proliferation of small studies and things like, like the number of studies we see on skills training for this and skills training for that, and I'm not saying those things aren't valuable because they give us important information, but we need to be thinking about what are the next big things to be thinking about. And I mean, I think, particularly, there are a couple of big things I can think of. One is, our effect sizes are good in DBT, but they could be better. And I think, DBT PTSD showed that. And of course, there's a big trial going on at the moment, which is comparing standard DBT against DBT PTSD for for adult women with BPD and suicidal behavior. So there's something about how can we improve we have an effective treatment, but how can we make it even better? Um, so I think that's one sort of kind of key issue. And
And
then as
work together,
and
right?
to
Like
work
Marsha's always
together
said,
to
we're
really
all interconnected,
we're all
right? Like,
interconnected, and how might we think about doing that together? And
mhm.
like kind of how might we think about what's needed to take the treatment to the next step? Um, and then, as I was saying that, I thought, yeah, there are two things, and now the second one has completely escaped my mind. But maybe it'll come back to me. But certainly that thing about increasing and improving the effect sizes, I think is very important. I mean, I think the other thing that we have talked a lot about is oh, I remember what the other thing was. The other thing is we still don't know much. I mean, Shelley McMain has done some great work here. It started off, but who is DBT best for? And can we do a better job at the start of identifying who might do well in the treatment and who might not? And for those who don't do well in the treatment, what do we know about them? And why is that? And is that something that, isn't it just that like this is not the right kind of treatment for them? Or is it that actually there's something that we could be doing in the treatment that would make it better? And is there something that's in the treatment already that would improve it? Or actually do we need to, are we in the realm of
Really looking at the nuance of the
really
treatment
looking at the
for,
nuance? And I think those are the two, and those two things are probably connected, of course, because if you were able to understand better who's not doing well and able to do something about that, that would boost the overall outcome. So I think those two things are some really key issues, and there will be others. Um, One of the other things that the research group has been looking at is, one of the things that can be tricky in research trials is um, you know, people don't always investigate things in the same way, and that sometimes can make it hard to really compare the results. And so there's a lot of expertise in this in the research group who are thinking about almost kind of producing guidance about, if you're going to run a DBT trial, these will be some of the things, and these would be the measures that you would use to try and get a bit of standardization. So those are the sorts of things that these sort of expert committees are really focusing on, which I think as you can see is more about that strategic mission for the treatment going forward, whereas the chapters are very much about how to get out what we have already out to the communities. And so there's those two things together are the kind
and I
of,
think, and that's the other really like admirable piece of this organization is the transparency,
yeah,
right? Like there's a lot of like the website is already
yes,
really
it's
getting
already
packed
there.
full of resources.
Yeah. And I mean, that's something we really want to develop. That's what some of our donations would go to. We've got more things that we want to get out there. We've also been doing some video, a little bit like this, conversations with key folk that we think the community might want to hear about, just to try and help people know a bit more about what we do. And so, we'll be putting those up on the website in fairly soon, next couple of months. I think so obviously we'll be letting people know about that through social media. Um, but yeah, so we really want to kind of connect with the DBT community and be a vehicle for other people connecting, but we don't want to replicate or, the other important things that people are already doing,
Yeah.
that in a way, as I say, we want to enable local, national societies, local to do what they do and to keep doing it, but to perhaps provide some of the I don't know guidance or expert views on some of the issues that maybe concern them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I'm like sitting here thinking about this, that the guidance, you have a wealth of knowledge that you could provide guidance
Mm.
all day long. And the way that this is set up is providing guidance within the context of a chapter, right? Like because
Right.
their context is going to
It's going
also
to
sort
be
of
different.
influence your guidance.
Exactly, that's right. So that when we're producing guidance, first off, we're trying to make sure we've got a representative people together producing it. And in particular, we're thinking about the differing contexts that we might have to be aware of. but also what we're wanting to do when we're producing it, though, is to make it sufficiently specific so that it's useful, but not so specific that actually it means that it can't be applied in contexts that are very different. So it needs to have a degree of flexibility.
Yeah, there's a difference between being specific and rigid.
That's exactly right. And it's not always an easy balance to find. And I think also we'll discover we've just set about we've got, as I said, we've got two sets of guidance on the website already around what it the curriculum that therapists should follow to become therapists, and then also about what qualities and skills you need to be a trainer in the treatment. And so we've asked the chapters, if they wish, to translate those into their own relevant languages. Now, for some languages, they are perfectly happy with it being in English, and that's fine. But for some languages, they're translating, and of course, then that raises some very important, interesting things when people are trying to translate things, and actually there actually might not be those concepts, or it wouldn't be expressed in
Well,
quite
yeah,
that
it's not a
way.
one-to-one
There's
translation.
not a one-to-one translation. So then it's good to have some of those conversations with colleagues about what it is that you would want, how would you express that? And, and I think that's also like a bit of, reciprocal learning. That's part of the transaction of
Hmm.
when what we have as DBT then encounters the realities of delivery, and then how we might work together to
Yeah.
resolve them. Yeah.
And, and what you all are doing is something that I think across the board in a lot of different industries and different scenarios could take heed to is having representation from at the table from those that you're speaking on behalf of, right? It's
Yes.
very easy to speak on behalf of this population of people, but that population is not at the table
No.
during that discussion. So this organization is really set up to have representation at the table.
It is, yes. And I think also yeah, really to start to have meaningful engagement. And I think that'll be an interesting and important challenge for us moving forward, because we are heavily dominated by North America and Northern Europe. There's increasing representation now from South America and coming on from Asia Pacific. Um, and there'll be some important things for us really to consider in those as we develop in that way, and to really work together. So it's exciting. Yeah. And of
It's a
course,
bit of a history lesson too, of
no,
just
exactly.
it's like a mental exercise of even learning about the
Yeah,
organization and learning about the chapters is a history lesson in and of
yeah.
itself.
No, exactly. And also just thinking, of course, there are, sometimes difficult geopolitical issues for us to think about, and, real challenges that some therapists, might really sort of struggle with, in terms of Europe, Russian DBT therapists and Ukrainian DBT therapists, and is it possible to be in the same organization? Is that permitted, by the geopolitical context? And there are some, other contexts, of course, across the world as well. The situation in Israel and in Gaza, that really make some of this very challenging work, and yet very important, because there is DBT in all of these parts of the world. And so we really want to connect with our colleagues in all of these different parts of the world and understand the real challenges that they're facing.
And
Um,
removes the judgment and the ignorance, right? Like ignorance and lack of education, right? Like just removes that in terms of,
yeah,
well, why isn't this part implementing this, right? Like it provides
yeah,
more context
give them more
into
context.
the challenges that we don't maybe face here in the
No,
US or in
exactly.
North America, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
No, exactly. And I think also as well, I think there's something to learn from, that there are parts of the world who are trying to implement DBT which are so much more resource poor than we are. I know when I talk to my colleagues in the healthcare systems here, they feel that there's a lot of resource poverty, which there is, relatively speaking,
Relative.
compared to some parts of the world. And yet, I think some of the parts of the world who are starting to implement now, who are really experiencing extreme resource poverty, there'll be things to learn from how they do that for those of us who are fortunate in how much resource that
Yeah, this
we
burst, we could just like put a little pin in our bubbles that we're living
yeah.
in.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that's also it's incredibly humbling,
Uh-huh.
when you start to
Yeah,
connect with people who are trying to implement, their clients are experiencing the same sorts of difficulties as our clients are, compounded often by other, war, conflict, other sorts of things. And then, how are they trying to do that? It's an incredibly humbling
yeah.
experience. And I think it's one of the great pleasures actually of working in this way with people from across the globe. Um,
Even with insurance and
yeah.
centralized medicine and all of that, like again, I think this just really highlights the bubbles that we live in and just
Yeah.
thinking this is the norm and this is just
Yeah.
how things operate.
Oh, yeah. And so I think that's really an important part of what we're doing together. I mean, it's quite a challenge, of course,
Uh,
just dealing
mhm.
with that. I mean, of course, because of the pandemic in a way, and the fact that we all went online, we can now meet, but finding times, so I was in a training and implementation.
It's 2 o'clock there, your time?
Yeah,
So that's
come and
the time
me,
I can't
the time
imagine just
difference.
that alone, the
And
challenge.
so, so I was in a meeting this week. It was 3 p.m. my time, but I had people joining from the west coast of the US. Of course, it was 7 a.m. for their time. I had people joining though from China and from Singapore, and it was kind of 11 p.m., midnight. Often our colleagues in Asia Pacific are joining us at midnight and sometimes at 2 in the morning to actually be part of this work. And I kind of, it is supremely humbling that people are willing to do that because it's so important to them to try and get high quality treatment out to clients in their areas. So
Yeah.
yeah, it has its challenges, but it's very rewarding.
It is. And it is, it's really the history lesson behind it and just the understanding. It gives a deeper appreciation for even the early work that Marcia developed. It
Absolutely.
really gives the appreciation of how it's held its test of time.
No, it really has. And I think also her vision for how this, could change lives and how it will change lives and but also how to go about it, is something that we hold very, very dear to our hearts and kind of thinking about how might we do that in ways that really are inclusive and and also very attentive to the power differentials and issues and I think we do have to be attentive. We've been thinking a lot in the community, haven't we, about anti-racism and about thinking about what it is that we might bring in relationships if we're in a position of power and privilege. And I think we do have to be careful there too when we're going into parts of the world who think very differently
Yeah.
to the way that we think in the parts of the world where DBT was developed and has then flourished. And so I'm going to be interviewing Shan Ling, who's the president of the Asia Pacific chapter, about some of those issues for our webinar series, because I think that's very interesting um, sort of transaction and tensions for us to pay attention to.
And as everybody's showing up humble and fallible too, right? Like it's just
Right.
a really collective group that
Yeah.
is learning from each other and nobody's trying to push a specific agenda that everybody else isn't a part of.
No, exactly. And to really try and recognize that, and it's one of the things really is to recognize that we can all get somewhat attached to doing DBT the way we do it in the way and then kind of thinking, okay, well, there's validity there. We do want to be able to hold our position and to recognize it's coming from where we're from and we're seeing
Exactly.
it because of the way we see the world and that there are other perspectives to embrace and take on board and really try to see those.
Yeah. And being able to, yeah, see the world for what it is versus for what we are. And
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is there anything else that that you think would be helpful for folks to know or in terms of, I know LinkedIn, you're very engaged on LinkedIn
Yes. Yeah.
for people to follow that to get up
Yes.
regular updates. And I will link
Yes.
the website for like the membership and just if anybody wanted to donate to some of these amazing initiatives of moving this forward to really disseminate and have everybody at the table that is representative of your work.
Yes. And I think also the other thing I would want to say is that obviously, some people might be in a position to donate finances, which would be lovely. And also, um, there is an opportunity to donate your time and your skill. So, if you are somebody who loves to do social media stuff, then, that we would also be happy to hear about that. Also, if you've got web design skills and would be willing to donate some of your time to help us with that, we'd be very grateful for that. I mean, as an organization, we don't want to be, we do want to be able to be in a position to remunerate people for giving their skills and their time. And we want to be very sensitive to the fact that sometimes people with low power often end up in positions where they're not being
Yeah.
properly recompensed. And unfortunately, at the moment, we have no income. So at the
Yeah.
moment, so if you are someone who is time rich, um, although I can't imagine anyone listening to yours is time rich, but if you do and you have those skill sets and would like to help us in our mission, we would very much like to hear from you. Yeah. And you could
And
message
there's a
the
contact
DBTA.
on the
Yes,
website and
we've
everything.
got like an email that you can send to, and we would very much like to hear from you.
Okay.
Um, and I think the one big thing that you would get is that if you are willing to do that, you get the opportunity to meet up with lots of people who know a lot about DBT. And so I think that there's something that you would get from that hopefully would at least pay in kind for the time people were given.
I mean, this really is a collective, like we can say over here in the US and North America track, like we could say, we go to is it DBT and we get to meet the experts in the field, but this really is a
It
collective
is. It's an
unit
international
of
collective.
experts.
It's an international collective of experts, and it's such a privilege to work with them and to really think about how we can bring that to as wider audience as possible, because we know not everyone has had that opportunity and doesn't have that opportunity to have that kind of access, and that's what we're really wanting to try and do. Yeah.
And in the spirit of DBT, we're just all coming together to find
We
the
are.
dialectical tension and
We
work
are.
to find the synthesis, right?
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah, that we're all connected and there are different perspectives. We're all trying to do slightly different things in this space, and sometimes there might be some tensions, and it's just important to talk about those and see what they are, and then to learn from those and to find our way forward. Yeah, yeah.
thank you so much for taking the time to share such a wealth of information. And it will be following you on LinkedIn, and any updates, we'll make sure that everybody is aware of the updates so that folks can stay abreast of
Yeah,
this
what's going
amazing
on?
mission going forward.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. I think it's the first time I've been interviewed about it, so it's very exciting.
I said this is a little bit of a dual function here. It's a little self-serving on my end of like, I want a little bit more information. And I think that if I want more information, there's a
And
lot of
other
other
people will
people out there
too.
that
Other
want it
people will
too.
too. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things to begin with. The challenge of just getting it set up was so that, and that therefore we weren't saying a lot about what was happening because it wasn't really set up. But now we are set up. Now we're in this process and we're wanting people to know more about it and to really take the mission
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody that you're working with for all the work that they are doing.
Yeah. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely.